Great. Hi, I'm Margie Caust. I'm really pleased to be here today for the Creative Bureaucracy Festival, and I welcome Cassie Robinson. We're going to have a conversation today about the idea of imagination infrastructure and what it can mean for bureaucracies, what it might mean for creative bureaucrats, what it might mean for cities and places. And I'm really looking forward to it. So thank you very much, Cassie, for joining us today at this conversation.
Thank you for me.
Just as a quick intro, Cassie is the Deputy Director of Funding Strategy at the National Lottery Community Fund, and she's responsible for innovation policy and practice and oversees the Climate Action Fund, the Digital Fund, and the Emerging Futures Fund, among other things. And that is an incredibly interesting collection of responsibilities and opportunities that you have. As a way of starting this, I have immersed myself in some of the writing that you've been doing on Medium, and I would just recommend people to follow up the work that Cassie's been doing. And she's very, very much a working out loud approach of sharing ideas as she goes along. And I was struck by how interesting your journey has been, from being a fashion designer, a service designer, being an entrepreneur, rethinking uniforms, to rethinking funerals. And you've worked inside, alongside, and outside loads of different institutions. So one of the things that you mentioned in one of the articles I read was how important it is for you to bring intent to your work. I just wondered whether you could just start off with just talking a bit about what intent looks like for you at the moment in your working life.
Yeah, I think, first of all, again, thanks for having me here. So I think intent is, for me, that's very much about, am I conscious of, am I thinking about where I can be most useful at this moment in time? And that in a couple of the pieces that you've read, I reference something called the Bacana two-loop model, which is basically looking at how change happens. Well, there's many ways in which change happens, but it's a useful, quite simplistic framework about sort of systemic change. And I have been using that for the last 11 years, really, to sort of situate myself in the work I'm currently doing at different times. So yeah, for me, it's about having that kind of consciousness, that awareness and that intent around, okay, well, at this moment in time, I'm doing this kind of work, and I'm doing this kind of work for these reasons, and I'm doing it for these reasons because I have a belief that it's going to affect or influence this kind of change.
I think the reason why I was struck by that idea was wondering whether people who work within bureaucracies also could be bringing that sort of sense of intent as well. Sometimes when you talk to people working in government organisations, there's a sense that they feel a little bit like they are there to be told what to do rather than to shape and influence the work that they do. So it feels to me like something that might be an idea for exploration with people in bureaucracies. I don't know what your experience of institutions. Just have you got a sense of how you have you always felt a sense of freedom within all the work that you've done, or do you feel like in some contexts you felt freer than in others?
I mean, definitely felt much freer not working inside an institution. A lot of my work has definitely not been inside the system, if you like. Although I would characterize most of my work as being someone that has one foot inside and one foot outside the system. But in the last nearly 3 years now, I have been working in a kind of large bureaucracy that's very linked to government. And there is bureaucracy, but I there are aspects of that I actually love and find very, very interesting. I think where I would say intent is really important in that kind of institution is, often bureaucracy has been layered up over time. It's rules, it's processes, it's policies that have been designed at a point in time. And I think for me, one of the things that I believe is that it's often not very adaptive. So why I use even the sort of metaphor of layering is it can become quite rigid and it can become out of date. So intent in a bureaucracy, I think, is always bringing that kind of questioning mind of is the bureaucracy still serving what we need to do? Like, is it still relevant? Does it still make sense? Are there better ways or new ways of having these kind of structures and rules and policies in place? Should we be testing them and recreating them and rethinking them in a more often and in a bit more of a dynamic way? So there's definitely less freedom when you work inside an institution, but I think that there's also the lack of freedom is replaced by the ability to have a different kind of impact. And so I think, that there's trade-offs wherever you position yourself in change work.
I think that's a very insightful. And so then if we move to the idea of imagination infrastructure, where did that emerge for you, and how did that become something that you thought was an interesting idea?
So I think it was really the bringing together of two different areas of interest. I think the imagination, just this recognition or this sense that we need more power in our imaginative capacity. We need to draw on our imagination more. We need to mess up and shake up and imagine differently. That's been something that I've been feeling for a couple of years, partly inspired by some other people's work like Rob Hopkins and Jeff Mulgan, but just working in UK civil society and feeling for quite some time that there was a kind of lack of imagination. I was in events where people would be perceiving the role of civil society as only being about the delivery of services, which just felt so reductive to who we are as civil society, who we are as people and communities. And I think, and I sort of want to sort of caveat that lack of imagination, the word lack doesn't ever sound very kind, and it's definitely not a critique of civil society, and that I think there's lots of reasons why there's been a lack of imagination, primarily because everyone is exhausted and under-resourced and has been for a long time. So there was this growing desire to want to do more work around how do you build the capacity in communities for more collective imagining, and collective also being important, because this wasn't about all of us as individuals having better access to or a strengthening of our own individual imaginations. It's very much about what can we imagine as the collective, what's the power in our collective imagination. And then the other thing that it started to link to was my growing interest in infrastructure, and infrastructure for me represents that kind of long-term investment in often the things that are much more invisible, that hold things together, that support things, that strengthen things, that kind of create that sort of scaffolding and support over the long term. And so I thought that there was something interesting in trying to bring together the collective imagination and the infrastructure into this idea of imagination infrastructuring. And we made it a verb intentionally because, again, it's not a one-off thing. It's like, how do you do that as a practice over time? How do you resource communities to do collective imagining in an iterative way over the long term?
I think partly it strikes a chord because of that sense of the overall investment in physical infrastructure has been so dominating over the last 100 or more years. And when you work within government, there's always that sense that the investment in a road or an investment in a bridge or in a high-speed train or something like that somehow is incredibly necessary and important. And but it's much harder to get the investment in the small scale or in the day-to-day, the lived experience, the sorts of spaces and places that I guess are necessary for thinking how we're going to solve problems or how we're going to approach complexity or all of those things. So in a way, it feels like there's been a whittling away of the imagination, which I think you've already said, within institutions. So it's a challenging thing because actually governments have tended to outsource their imaginations over the last, essentially to the bigger consulting firms. With this, we can see with physical infrastructure that governments are kind of commissioning and doing studies and organising it, how it is delivered and bringing a lot of funding around it. Have you thought at all, or how might we think about governments relative to imagination infrastructure? Is it a different type of role that they would play, and how have you thought about that so far in the work that you've been doing?
A little. I mean, it's definitely not an easy sell. Invest in our kind of collective imagination. But I think through the Emerging Futures Fund, which is a funding program we set up last summer in the midst of the kind of first wave of the pandemic, we were obviously doing a lot of crisis and responsive emergency funding, but we were also able to create a funding program that recognized that this was a moment in time, or lots of moments in time, where cracks were opening and there was a need to imagine where we could go from here that was going to be different and would work better for more people. And that really required our collective imagination. And we gave 52 grants out to different communities across the UK. And some of the most successful of those have been because they were in partnership with the local government. And it meant that they could really demonstrate why this kind of resource and capacity building around our collective imagination locally in communities is important and can directly then be used to influence and shape the future of a place. One of the examples, in the UK, the government is investing a lot of money, and it's very, very high up in the sort of policy agendas, this idea of levelling up, of bringing more shared prosperity to more places in the UK, and especially those that have been sort of left behind in a very economic sense. And in that kind of levelling up agenda, it's obviously incredibly important that communities themselves get to shape how their places are leveled up and what their places look like in the future. And so that's been where we've been able to start to bring in the imagination infrastructure work, because actually, if you're going to facilitate and enable communities to do that shaping work, the starting point for that, I believe, needs to start much further upstream than a citizen assembly and that kind of deliberative democracy, which is growing in popularity. And I think there's a real role for things like citizen assemblies, but I don't think they necessarily they already have a set of questions that basically you're there to deliberate, whereas I think the imagination work is about defining the questions as well. So that's where I see it particularly being useful in the UK context, is where we've got quite a lot of resource going into this kind of levelling up agenda.
One of the things that really impressed me about that Emerging Futures Fund, I mean, the criteria almost that you've written for funding programs under that fund feel like it is a way of shaping, what you're saying, well, this is what we're interested in, and we're not interested in something that's more conventional necessarily. But what I also really love about it is this idea that you're funding for like some programs for 10 years, even though they're quite formative and very much at a point working within a sort of a sense of ambiguity, you're still allowed or expressed a lot of confidence in that idea going forward over a period of time, which is quite unusual for government funding programs.
Yeah, that's a different program from the Emerging Futures Fund, so the Emerging Futures Fund was actually quite small, quite short grants, but we called them inquiries, and that was really us almost trying to use funding as a way of developing funding policy or funding strategy. So can we, rather than going out and doing big consultations that take 2 years, and can you actually use grants as questions for communities to be defining and asking questions? And the framing of that program was very much to try and say, how do we think differently at this time, and how do we think beyond what you might already know and understand, what might feel unfamiliar, and how do we not just repattern the status quo? How do we pattern a different future when the current reality, made very evident through COVID, was not working for so many people? The Growing Great Ideas Fund, which is these 10-year grants that you mentioned, has also been something we've established in the last sort of six months. And I guess the context of the pandemic made that more possible in a way, because again, there's very few people that I know that could point to many things at the moment and say, this is really working, let's do more of this. We know all the answers, we know how things need to be. I feel a lot more people are in that space of recognizing there's so much that we don't know and understand, there's so much to learn, there's so many things we've got to adapt, and there's lots we have to shift into an entirely different reality. And so the Growing Great Ideas Fund, these 10-year grants, as you say, there's a lot we still can't know about them, but the teams, the groups, the networks, the ecosystems that are part of those grants are definitely asking the kinds of questions that we need to ask, and they have demonstrated that they're really good at asking good questions, experimenting, learning from those experiments, doing something different or continuing, and that in a way we've invested in them in terms of who they are, the values that underpin their work, and then how they are trying to get to this different reality.
Yes, well, thanks for clarifying the difference between those two. And I think that it's so obviously over the last few years, there's been things like innovation labs and so on growing that are trying to rethink things in that sort of, through that sort of method. But both of those two areas of essentially funding, questioning, or funding and opening up of a exploration of something feels quite an unusual thing to do. How do you work out? I mean, are you saying that you really invest in the people that you think have got interesting perspectives, or how are you thinking? How are you going to know where it will take you? This sort of work.
I think whilst these tenure grants are definitely a sort of working with emergence and complexity, in which it's incredibly hard to sort of put existing ways we might think about measurement or impact onto them. It is still very important to try and document, make visible, understand what progress looks like. So we are still going, that there's different kinds of data that we will be using. They all have their own design set of different kind of progress indicators, and the most important thing in those cultures of those initiatives is that they're continually learning and inquiring and bringing in different kinds of data to do that. And when I talk about data, I don't, I mean both lived, learned and practiced experience kinds of data, not just quant data, other kinds of intelligences. But it is, being able to evidence progress and change is still really important. It's not just like, let's just throw everything up to the wind and see what happens, see what emerges. And you can't do that in a, you just can't do that when you're working in a government body that has accountability to public money. And I think the initiatives themselves would be undervaluing what they do by not trying to kind of bring kind of some evidence to how they're progressing the work.
Mm-hmm. We're in a very sort of strange era, it feels like, excuse me, where we, excuse me,
sorry,
where we are struggling toward finding the questions that we should be asking and asking them. Sorry, I don't know.
Oh.
I don't know what's happened to my voice. Hopefully they can cut this out. Asking the questions that we need to ask is just such an important part of this. Oh God! Hopefully, Ernest, you can cut this bit out of this conversation.
Take your time.
I will just take a minute.
Oh yeah, just take a minute.
So let's just go back then to the idea of, well, firstly, one of the themes of the festival is a humble government. I don't know do you have any thoughts about that? Because obviously it's a theme that the Finnish government has taken on quite seriously, this sense of governments need to be very open, that they don't have the answers to these solving these big questions that we have, and the only way forward is for them to open that up to many different people, work with people in new ways, and take a very much a learning perspective on it. Is that at all a theme in the work that you're involved in, or is it something that is just sort of like a parallel area of thinking?
I think the word humility is used a lot actually in a lot of funding, a lot of grant making communities. What that actually means in practice, that's quite, it's a word personally that I have some issue with, because humility is really important, but not if it kind of excuses people being responsible and accountable and showing leadership. I think it's very easy to talk about being humble as a way of avoiding using your positionality, taking responsibility for your power, and actually having integrity to your leadership. So yeah, it's quite an interesting word. I mean, I definitely think government, any institution, anyone with power right now who does suggest that they have the answers is probably not being very honest. So I think it's really important for all of us to acknowledge that there is so much we don't know, and that to be able to orient ourselves. Who does know is definitely not going to be just the people working in government. You know, there's obviously many people with different kinds of lived, learned and practice experience that need to be part of any kind of question setting and question answering. But I'm particularly interested in actually the people that are always the outliers, the people, not just those that are underrepresented or minority groups, in the sense that we might conceive of that, but also the people that ideas always seem too difficult, too radical, too unusual, too unfamiliar, because actually in a few years' time, it's always those ideas that are the ones we should have listened to. I mean, not always, but a lot. But yeah, I'm uncomfortable with people only being humble if they're not also going to step into their responsibility and have ambition for the money that they spend, because without that kind of ambition, we're just going to keep plaster sticking.
Look, Cassie, thank you so much for being a part of the conversation today. I really appreciate you making the time, and I think this is a theme that I'm very interested to see how it develops. It's, as I said, it's very important, I think, to how government starts to find different spaces, not just in itself, but with and, you know, with other people, other parts of the world, and to start to ask the questions that maybe many are not even beginning to ask yet. There are questions to be found. So I think we're all very inspired with the work that you're doing, and thank you very much for being here today.
Oh, thanks for having me.